I still remember the exact moment my father slid his glass across the table, leaned back in his chair and said, "Transfer the college fund, Emily." Like he was asking me to pass the salt, like the number sitting in that account didn't represent 15 years of my life. There were 28 people at that dinner, crystal glasses catching the light, my mother's 60th birthday banner stretched across the wall, my brother Daniel smirking into his whiskey, and my daughter Sophie sitting 2 seats away from me, quietly scrolling on her phone, not realizing they were talking about her future like it was a family expense line item. My name is Emily Carter, I'm 38 years old, and 3 years ago, my parents tried to take my daughter's entire college fund in front of our extended family, and everyone in that room expected me to say yes. If you've ever been the one in your family who's expected to give without question, you already know how this feels, but what happened next is something none of them saw coming. The thing is, this didn't start at that dinner, it never does, it started years earlier, in smaller moments that didn't seem important at the time but built into something I couldn't ignore anymore. Growing up, there were 2 children in the Carter household, Daniel and me, but only one of us was considered an investment. My father, Richard Carter, ran a mid-sized logistics company outside Chicago, the kind of business that looks stable on paper but always seems to need just a little more money behind the scenes, and my mother, Linda, managed appearances like it was a full-time job, charity boards, neighborhood committees, the kind of life where everything has to look perfect even if it isn't. Daniel fit that image effortlessly, confident, outgoing, always talking about big ideas, big deals, big futures, and my parents loved that about him. They poured money into his ventures, his education, his potential, even when those ventures quietly failed behind closed doors. Me, I was the practical one, the one who worked 2 jobs in college because we can't afford to support both of you, the one who learned early that asking for help meant being reminded of what I wasn't. When I got pregnant with Sophie at 23, I didn't get a lecture, I didn't get support, I got silence, the kind that tells you everything you need to know without a single word being said. I remember sitting at my parents' kitchen table, hands shaking, telling them I was going to keep the baby, and my father just nodded once and said, "Then you're on your own," like he was signing off on a business decision, not his daughter's life. That was the moment something shifted in me. I stopped expecting anything from them and I started building something for myself and, more importantly, for Sophie. Every dollar I earned after that had a purpose. I worked overtime, took freelance accounting clients at night, skipped vacations, skipped new cars, skipped anything that didn't move us forward, and little by little that college fund grew 10,000, 20, 50, until one day I opened the account and saw a number that made all those years feel real. It wasn't just money, it was proof that I could give my daughter something I never had: security, choice, a future that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. So when my father looked at me across that table in front of 28 relatives and said, "We need that money for Daniel," I felt something cold settle in my chest, not shock, not even anger, just clarity. Because in that moment I realized they hadn't changed at all. Not after all these years, not after everything I'd built. To them, I was still the same person I'd always been, the one who could be asked to sacrifice without question. What I didn't realize then, sitting under those soft dining room lights with every eye on me, was that this moment wasn't just another demand, it was the beginning of something that would change every single one of our lives, and they had no idea what was coming. No one spoke for about 3 seconds after he said it, and in my family, silence like that always meant one thing: everyone was waiting to see how I would respond. My mother was the first to fill it, setting her fork down with a soft clink and giving me that tight smile she used whenever she wanted to make something unreasonable sound perfectly normal. "It is just temporary, Emily," she said, her voice calm, controlled, practiced. "Your brother is going through a difficult phase and family helps family." And just like that, the narrative shifted, not about taking from Sophie, not about crossing a line, but about me refusing to help. I glanced at Daniel, who did not even bother to look at me, just swirling the amber liquid in his glass like this was already decided, like the outcome had been agreed on before I even sat down at that table. "How much?" I asked, even though I already knew the number, and my father leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, the way he used to when closing deals. 120,000, he said, clearly, evenly, like it was nothing more than a figure on a spreadsheet. That number had taken me over a decade to build, years of early mornings, late nights, skipped opportunities, and he said it in one breath. Across the table, I heard a soft exhale, one of my aunts shaking her head slightly as if I was already being unreasonable, and then someone else added, "It is not like Sophie needs all of that right away. And that was the moment my chest tightened, because they were not just asking, they were justifying, rewriting reality in real time so that taking from my daughter sounded responsible. I turned to my mother, hoping for something, anything that resembled hesitation, but she only nodded once, reinforcing my father's words, and said, "You can rebuild it, Emily, you always do." And there. It was the assumption that I would carry the weight again, that I would sacrifice again, that I would fix what someone else had broken. I looked down at my hands, steady, controlled, the same hands that had balanced budgets, negotiated contracts, and slowly built a future for my daughter without anyone's help. And for a brief second I almost said yes, not because I agreed, but because that pattern was so deeply ingrained in me that saying no felt like breaking something fundamental. But then, I heard Sophie's voice in my head, not from that night, but from a week earlier, sitting at our small kitchen table, laptop open, showing me a list of colleges she was researching, her eyes lighting up. As she talked about programs, internships, possibilities. "I just want options, Mom," she had said, simple, honest, and I realized that what they were asking for was not just money, it was those options. I lifted my head and met my father's eyes, and for the first time in a long time I did not look away. "No," I said quietly, not raising my voice, not making a scene, just one word. The reaction was immediate. My mother's smile disappeared. Replaced by something sharper, my father leaned back. Slowly, his expression hardening, and Daniel finally looked up, his eyebrows lifting slightly like he could not believe I had actually said it. "Excuse me?" my father asked, his tone dropping just enough to remind everyone who he thought was in control, and I repeated it, still calm. "No, I am not giving you Sophie's college fund." And this time there was no mistaking it. A ripple moved through the table, chairs shifting, quiet murmurs starting. And my mother shook her head, disappointed, almost embarrassed. "Emily, do not be selfish," she said, the word landing exactly how it was meant to, like a label I was supposed to accept. Selfish after everything, after years of being the one who never asked for anything. I felt something settle inside me then, something solid, unmovable, and I realized this was not just a request, it was a test, one I had been failing my entire life, and for the first time, I was not going to. But what I did not know, sitting there under those soft lights with my entire family watching, was that this single word, no, was about to cost me everything I had left with them, and at the same time set something in motion that none of us could have predicted. My father did not raise his voice, he never needed to, the way he looked at me was enough, slow, deliberate, like he was recalculating my value in real time. And then he gave a short nod, the kind that signals a decision has been made. "If that is how you want to play this," he said, folding his napkin and placing it beside his plate, "then you should understand what that means." And I felt every eye at the table shift again, not toward him this time, but toward me, waiting, measuring, judging. My mother leaned in slightly, her tone softer but sharper underneath. "Emily, think carefully," she said. "Family support is not one-sided." And there it was, the condition, the quiet contract I had been living under my entire life, finally spoken out loud. I could feel the weight of it pressing in from all sides, the expectation that I would correct myself, apologize, fix the discomfort I had just created, but instead I sat there, hands still, posture steady, and said nothing. Daniel let out a small laugh under his breath, not loud enough to be called out, but loud enough for me to hear, and he finally spoke, his voice casual, almost bored. "You are making this bigger than it needs to be," he said. "It is just money, and it is not like Sophie is going to Harvard." A few quiet chuckles followed, not from everyone, but enough to remind me exactly where I stood in that room. Something in me tightened at that. Not anger, not yet, but something colder, something clearer, because this was not about helping him, it never had been, it was about what they believed I deserved, what my daughter deserved, and what they were entitled to take. "We are trying to protect the family," my mother added quickly, as if smoothing over the moment. "Daniel's business is in a temporary setback, and once it stabilizes, everything will be returned." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because I had heard variations of that promise my entire life. Money going one direction, never quite finding its way back. I finally pushed my chair back slightly, the soft scrape against the floor cutting through the room, and stood up, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to shift the balance of the moment. "I said no," I repeated, my voice still even, and this time I did not wait for a response. My father's jaw tightened just a fraction, but I caught it, and he looked at me the way he used to when I was younger, when I had disappointed him by choosing my own path. "Then do not expect anything from this family moving forward," he said, each word measured, controlled, final, and for a second the old instinct flared up again, the urge to negotiate, to soften it, to keep the connection intact at any cost. But then I thought about every time that connection had come with a condition, every time support had been transactional, every time I had been expected to give more than I received, and I realized something I had never allowed myself to fully accept before. There was nothing there to lose that had not already been taken from me in smaller pieces over the years. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and reached for my purse, and as I turned, I caught a glimpse of Sophie looking up from her phone, confusion on her face, her eyes moving between me and her grandparents, trying to understand what was happening without being pulled into it. And I gave her a small, reassuring look, the kind that says everything is fine even when it is not. I walked out of that dining room without looking back, past the long table, past the decorations, past the people who had already started whispering as soon as I stood up, and out into the quiet night air where everything suddenly felt clearer, sharper, almost lighter. I did not realize it then, standing in that driveway with my keys in my hand and my phone buzzing with messages I had not yet read. But that moment, that choice to walk away without negotiating, without explaining, without fixing it for them, was not just the end of something. It was the beginning of a shift I had been building toward for years, and the consequences of that shift were going to reach much further than any of them expected. The drive home was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, not tense, not heavy, just still, and I kept both hands on the wheel as the streetlights passed in steady intervals, each one casting brief flashes of light across the dashboard, and Sophie sat beside me, her phone resting in her lap now untouched, her eyes on the road ahead like she was trying to piece together what had just happened without asking the question she was clearly holding back. I waited until we turned onto our street, the familiar row of modest houses, the porch lights, the calm that always felt separate from my parents' world. And as I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, she finally spoke, her voice careful, measured. "Are we in trouble?" And that question hit me harder than anything that had been said at that table, because it told me exactly how she saw it, not as something wrong done to her, but as something we might have done wrong. I turned to her then, fully making sure she could see my face clearly in the dim light. "No," I said, steady, certain, "we are not in trouble." And she studied me for a second, searching for hesitation, for doubt, and when she did not find it, she nodded once, slow, accepting, and that was enough for her. Inside the house, everything looked exactly the same as it had a few hours earlier, the stack of mail on the counter, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the small lamp in the living room casting a warm glow, and for a moment, it felt like we had stepped back into a version of our lives untouched by what had just happened. But my phone buzzing against the kitchen counter pulled me back immediately. I picked it up and saw the notifications, one after another, messages from my mother, my father, a few relatives whose names I had not seen on my screen in months, all arriving within minutes of each other, and I did not need to open them to know the tone. I had heard it too many times before, disappointment framed as concern, pressure disguised as reason. I opened the first one anyway, my mother's name at the top, and read, "I think you are overreacting. We need to talk like adults," followed by another, "Your father is very upset," and then a third, "Do not let pride damage your relationship with your family." And I almost laughed at that, not out of humor but out of recognition, because pride had never been the issue, it had always been boundaries. I set the phone down without replying, something I had never done before, not like this, not without immediately trying to fix things, smooth things over, restore whatever version of peace they expected from me. Sophie moved into the living room, turning on the television more out of habit than interest, and I stood there in the kitchen for a moment longer, letting the silence settle, letting the absence of their voices feel real. Over the next hour, the messages kept coming, shifting in tone exactly as I knew they would, from disappointment to frustration, from frustration to subtle blame, my father's finally appearing short, direct, "You are making a mistake," and then another, "Call me." And I did not that night, not the next morning, not even when the calls started, one after another, my phone lighting up with his name, then my mother's, then Daniel's for the first time in years. And that was when I knew this was not just about the money anymore, this was about control slipping, about a pattern breaking in a way they were not prepared for. 2 days passed, and the house remained quiet, no visits, no unexpected drop-ins, just messages that eventually slowed, then stopped, replaced by something else entirely, something colder, more distant. And on the third day, I received an email from my father, not a message, not a call, but an email, formal, structured, and when I opened it, I saw exactly what he had meant at that table. A list of things. connections, introductions, support that I had never asked for but that he now made clear would no longer be available, as if he was closing an account that had always been in his name. I read it once, then again, taking in each line, each carefully chosen word, and when I finished I set my phone down slowly, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar, because for the first time, everything was out in the open, no more unspoken expectations, no more quiet transactions, just a clear line drawn between what they believed I owed them and what I was no longer willing to give. And as I stood there in my kitchen, looking at the life I had built piece by piece without them, I realized something I had not fully allowed myself to see before. I had already been living without their support for years. I just had not called it that yet, and what they thought they were taking away from me now was something I had quietly learned to replace long ago. But what they still did not understand was that this time, there would be no rebuilding for them. Not in the way they expected, not with the outcome they had already decided in their heads, because something had shifted and it was not going to shift back. The next few weeks did not explode the way I thought they would. There was no dramatic confrontation, no one showing up at my door demanding explanations. Instead it was something quieter, something more deliberate, like a slow withdrawal of presence that made the absence feel intentional. Birthdays passed without invitations. Group messages I used to be included in suddenly stopped appearing, and when I checked social media, I saw photos of family dinners, holidays, small gatherings where everyone was smiling like nothing had changed except I was no longer there. At first, it stung in a way I did not expect, not because I wanted to be part of those moments, but because it confirmed something I had always felt but never fully accepted, that my place in that family had always been conditional. Sophie noticed it too, not immediately but gradually, when she asked one Saturday morning, "Are we going to Grandma's this year for Thanksgiving?" And I paused just long enough for her to read the answer in my face before I even said it out loud, "Not this year," and she nodded slowly, absorbing it without pushing further, but I could see the questions forming, the quiet recalibration of what family meant in her world. Life, however, did not stop. It rarely does, and in some ways it became simpler, cleaner, without the constant undercurrent of expectation, and I leaned into that, focusing on what I could control: my work, my clients, the systems I had built over the years that had quietly grown into something more stable than I had ever given myself credit for. I started taking on larger contracts, projects I might have hesitated to accept before because I was always balancing someone else's needs. And for the first time, I made decisions based entirely on what made sense for me and for Sophie, not on how it would be perceived or whether it would disrupt someone else's plans. Months passed, then a year, and the college fund remained untouched, sitting there as both a safety net and a symbol of everything I had protected. And Sophie thrived in ways that had nothing to do with money. Her grades improved, her confidence grew, she started talking about internships, about ideas, about building something of her own instead of just following a path laid out for her. And I listened, really listened, in a way I wish someone had done for me at her age. Occasionally there would be a message from my mother, brief, neutral, like nothing had happened, "Hope you are doing well," or "Sophie must be busy with school," and I would respond politely, carefully, keeping the distance intact because I understood now that reconnecting without addressing what had happened would only reset the same pattern. Daniel, on the other hand, never reached out again, and from what I heard through indirect channels, his business had not recovered the way my parents had expected, which explained the urgency of that request at the dinner more than anything they had said that night. One afternoon, about 18 months after everything changed, I received a call from a number I did not recognize, and I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer, and when I did, the voice on the other end introduced himself as a financial advisor representing one of my former clients, someone I had worked with years earlier on a small project that had grown into something much larger, and he said they were looking for someone to consult on a new venture, something complex, something with potential, and as he explained the scope, the numbers, the scale of what they were building, I felt that same quiet clarity settle in again. The kind that comes when opportunity meets preparation. I did not say yes immediately. I asked questions, I reviewed documents, I approached it the same way I had approached everything else in my life, carefully, deliberately, and when I finally agreed, I had no idea that this decision, this one project, would begin a chain of events that would not only change my financial reality, but would eventually circle back in a way that connected directly to that dinner table, to that request, to that single word I had said no, because what they had seen as a refusal, as a loss for them, was actually the moment everything started aligning in a way none of us had anticipated, and I did not realize then just how far that alignment was going to go. The first few weeks of that new project felt different from anything I had worked on before, not because of the workload, which was intense, But because of the scale, the kind of numbers being discussed in meetings, the level of precision expected, the way every decision carried weight far beyond a single balance sheet, and I found myself stepping into it with a focus that surprised even me, like all the years of being overlooked had quietly trained me for this exact moment. The client, a technology firm based out of Austin, was expanding aggressively, acquiring smaller companies, restructuring internal systems, and they needed someone who could see patterns across complex financial structures, someone who could anticipate problems before they surfaced, and for reasons I did not fully understand at the time, they trusted me to do exactly that. I spent long evenings at my kitchen table, documents spread out, laptop open, Sophie doing her homework across from me, the two of us working in parallel silence that felt more like partnership than obligation, and every now and then she would look up and ask a question about what I was doing, not because she needed to know, but because she was curious, genuinely interested in how things worked, and I would explain it to her in simple terms, watching the way she processed information, the way she connected ideas, and I started to notice something that made me pause. She did not just understand, she saw things, small details, inconsistencies, possibilities that even I had to take a second look at. One night, she pointed at a chart I had been reviewing for nearly an hour and said, "Why does that number not match the trend?" And I leaned closer, following her line of thought, and realized she was right, a subtle discrepancy that had been buried under layers of data, and it hit me then, not as a sudden revelation but as a quiet recognition, that Sophie had something I could not teach, something that went beyond what I had built through experience. The project grew, meetings became more frequent, my role expanded, and with each phase the impact of the work became clearer. Decisions we made influenced millions of dollars, sometimes more, and I handled it the only way I knew how, methodically, carefully, never assuming anything, always double-checking, always asking one more question than everyone else in the room. About 6 months in, the lead partner on the project asked me to join a smaller, more focused team, a group that was working on a specific division within the company, one that was being positioned for rapid growth, and that was when the numbers started to shift in a way I could not ignore. Projections that seemed ambitious at first began to align with real performance, and the conversations moved from sustainability to expansion, from stability to valuation. I did not think about what it meant beyond the work itself. I did not connect it to anything personal, not yet, because for me it was still about doing the job well, about maintaining the standard I had set for myself long before anyone else noticed. At home, life remained steady. Sophie continued to grow into her own rhythm, balancing school, new interests, and the kind of independence that comes when a young person starts to see their future as something they can shape rather than something that happens to them. And every now and then I would catch glimpses of that same clarity in her, the same ability to step back and see the bigger picture, and I wondered quietly where it would take her. There were still moments when the past would surface, small reminders of the distance that now existed between us and my family, a holiday card that arrived without a personal note, a brief message from my mother that stayed firmly on the surface, never acknowledging what had actually happened. But those moments felt different now, less like wounds and more like echoes of something that no longer defined me. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, I closed my laptop and sat back in my chair, the numbers from the latest report still fresh in my mind, and for the first time I allowed myself to think about what this project might become, not just for the company but for me, for Sophie, for the life we were building. And as I looked across the room at her, focused on her own work, completely unaware of the magnitude of what was unfolding around us, I realized that whatever was coming next was not going to look anything like the life my parents had tried to control, because this time the foundation was different, the decisions were ours, and the outcome was something they had never accounted for. About 9 months into the project, everything accelerated in a way that felt almost surreal, not chaotic but precise, like a system reaching the exact point it had been built for, and I started getting invited into meetings that were smaller, quieter, but far more significant, conversations where decisions were not just discussed but finalized, where numbers were not projections anymore but commitments. The division I had been working on was outperforming every expectation, not by a small margin but by a scale that shifted the entire company's valuation. And I remember sitting in a conference room one afternoon, listening as one of the partners outlined the updated figures, 8 digits turning into 9, estimates being replaced with confirmed offers, and for a moment I just sat there, taking it in, not reacting, not celebrating, just understanding what it meant. When I got home that evening, Sophie was at the kitchen counter again, textbook spread out, a half-finished cup of tea beside her, and she looked up when I walked in, immediately reading something in my expression. "Big day?" she asked, and I nodded once, setting my bag down. "Bigger than I expected." I said, and she smiled slightly like she already knew that answer would come eventually. Over the next few weeks, things became more structured, more formal, contracts were drafted, reviewed, revised, and the language shifted from possibility to execution. And that was when they approached me with something I had not anticipated, an equity position tied directly to the performance of the division, not just compensation for my work, but a stake in what we had built. I remember sitting there, the document in front of me, the numbers clear, defined, and realizing that this was not just another project, this was a turning point, the kind that does not happen often, if at all. I did not rush into it. I reviewed every clause, every condition, approached it the same way I had approached everything else, carefully, methodically. And when I finally signed, it was not with excitement but with certainty, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you are stepping into. At home, nothing outwardly changed. We still had dinner at the same table, still talked about school, about plans, about the small details that made up our daily lives, but underneath that, something was shifting. Something that I could feel but had not yet fully articulated. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Sophie leaned against the counter and said, almost casually, "You know, I do not think I want to take the traditional path." And I paused, turning slightly to look at her, not surprised but curious. "What do you mean?" I asked, and she shrugged lightly. "College, I mean, I might still go, but I do not think it is the only option anymore." And I watched her for a second, seeing the confidence in the way she said it, not rebellious, not dismissive, just thoughtful, considered, and it struck me how different her mindset was from what I had grown up with, how she saw choices where I had seen limitations. I nodded slowly. "Then we figure out what makes sense for you," I said, and she smiled, relieved, like she had expected resistance and found none. Later that night, after she had gone to her room, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, reviewing the latest updates on the project, and for the first time I allowed myself to connect the dots, the college fund, the decision I had made, the path Sophie was considering, and the position I now held in something that was growing at a rate I had never experienced before. The numbers on the screen were no longer abstract, they were real, tangible, and tied directly to us in a way that changed the entire equation. And I realized that the question my parents had asked that night, the assumption that Sophie's future depended on that one account, was already outdated, already irrelevant in a way they could not have imagined. But what I did not realize then, sitting there in that quiet kitchen with the soft hum of the house around me, was just how significant that shift was going to become, not just for us but for them, because the distance they had created, the line they had drawn, was about to intersect with something far bigger than any of us had anticipated. And when it did, the balance of everything would change in a way that could not be undone. The official offer came on a Tuesday morning at 9:14 a.m., an email marked high priority with a subject line that looked simple on the surface but carried more weight than anything I had seen before, and I sat at my desk for a full minute before opening it, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that whatever was inside would change things in a way that could not be reversed. When I finally clicked it open, the numbers were exactly what we had been building toward: confirmed valuation, finalized acquisition terms, and the equity structure outlined in precise detail. And as I read through it line by line, I felt that same steady clarity settle in, the kind that does not come with excitement or disbelief, just a quiet recognition that everything had aligned exactly as it was supposed to. Later that day, I joined a call with the core team, the same voices I had been working with for months, but the tone was different now, more formal, more contained, because this was no longer about planning, it was about execution. And when they walked through the final numbers, I did the math in my head almost automatically, connecting percentages to valuation, outcomes to timelines, and for the first time I saw it clearly, not as a projection, not as a possibility, but as a reality that was already taking shape. When the call ended, I closed my laptop slowly and sat there for a moment, the room quiet around me, the weight of it settling in not as something overwhelming, but as something definitive. That evening I found Sophie in the living room, her laptop open, a notebook beside her filled with sketches and ideas, not assignments, not structured work, but something she had been building on her own. And when she looked up, she immediately noticed the difference in me, the same way she always did. "It happened, did it not?" she asked. And I nodded once, sitting down across from her. "Yes," I said simply, and she smiled, not surprised, just confirming something she had already expected. I did not go into the details, not yet, because the numbers themselves were not the point. What mattered was what they represented, the shift, the independence, the confirmation that everything we had built was now operating on an entirely different level. Over the next few weeks, the process moved forward quickly, documents finalized, signatures completed, transitions executed with a level of precision that left no room for doubt, and my role shifted with it from consultant to stakeholder, from participant to someone whose decisions now carried a different kind of weight. And with that shift came attention, not the kind I had ever sought out, but the kind that follows numbers like these: inquiries, introductions, conversations that suddenly included me in ways they never had before. And I handled it the only way I knew how. Steady, measured, never assuming anything had fundamentally changed about who I was or how I worked. At home, Sophie continued moving forward in her own way, refining her ideas, exploring opportunities that did not follow a traditional path, and I supported her without pushing, without directing, letting her find her own direction the same way I had learned to find mine. And one evening, as we were sitting at the kitchen table, she looked up from her notes and said, almost casually, "I think I want to build something before I decide anything else." And I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant without needing further explanation. It was not about rejecting one path for another. It was about recognizing that she had options, real options, not limited by a single account or a predefined expectation. What I did not expect, however, was how quickly the outside world would begin to connect those dots, because as the deal became public, as names and figures started appearing in industry reports and financial summaries, the information spread in a way that was both controlled and inevitable, and somewhere within that flow of information a connection was made, a recognition of who I was, where I came from, and who I was connected to, and I did not realize it at first, not until my phone lit up one afternoon with a name I had not seen in nearly 2 years. A name that immediately brought me back to that dining room, to that table, to that moment when everything had shifted. And as I looked at it, watching it ring, I understood that this was not just a call. It was the beginning of something coming full circle in a way none of them had anticipated. And this time the position I held was not the one they remembered. I let it ring the first time not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to see if it would stop, if this was a single attempt or the beginning of something more persistent. And when it stopped after exactly 22 seconds, I set my phone down and went back to what I was doing, not rushing, not reacting, just observing. 5 minutes later it rang again, the same name, the same number, and this time I answered, not immediately, but on the fourth ring, controlled, measured. "Hello," I said, my voice even, and there was a brief pause on the other end, the kind that happens when someone is recalibrating their approach. "Emily," my father said. His tone different from what I remembered, not softer exactly, but less certain, like he was choosing his words more carefully than usual. "I was hoping you would pick up." And I leaned back slightly in my chair, listening, not responding right away, letting the silence do what it always does, reveal intent. "I heard about your situation," he continued, and I almost smiled at that phrasing, the way he avoided specifics, the way he framed it as something external, something that had happened to me rather than something I had built. "What situation is that?" I asked calmly, and there was another pause, shorter this time. "The company," he said, more directly now. "The deal, the valuation." And there it was, the confirmation, not from him telling me, but from him knowing. I did not respond immediately. I let him continue because I knew he would. "We should talk," he added, "in person." And the word we hung there, carrying more weight than it should have, because it implied something that had not existed for a long time. "About what?" I asked, still steady, still giving nothing away, and this time he did not hesitate. "There are some things happening with Daniel's business," he said, and I could hear the shift, the real reason beneath the surface. "Opportunities, partnerships, and given your current position, it would make sense for the family to align." And there it was again, the same language, the same structure, just updated to fit a different context. I glanced across the room at Sophie, who was sitting on the couch with her laptop, unaware of the conversation but very much the center of everything that had led to this moment. And I felt that same clarity settle in, the same one I had felt at the dinner table, but this time it was sharper, more defined. "I do not think that makes sense," I said simply, and the silence that followed was different, heavier, not confusion this time, but resistance meeting something it could not immediately move. "Emily," he said, his voice tightening just slightly, "this is not the same situation as before." And I let that sit for a second before responding. "You are right," I said, "it is not." And that was when I heard it, not in his words but in the space between them, the realization that the dynamic had shifted in a way he could not control. He cleared his throat lightly, adjusting, recalculating again. "We can discuss terms," he said, more formal now, "structures that would benefit everyone." And I almost laughed, not out of disrespect but out of recognition, because this was the same conversation, just dressed differently, the same expectation that I would contribute, that I would adjust, that I would make it work. "I am not interested," I said, still calm, still even, and this time there was no pause, just a direct response. You are making a mistake, he said, echoing the exact words from years earlier, and for a moment, it felt like time had folded in on itself, like we were back at that table. Except we were not, because everything around that moment had changed. I stood up slowly, walking toward the window, looking out at the quiet street, the same one I had stood on the night I left that dinner, and I realized something then, something that made everything else feel distant, almost irrelevant. This was not about convincing him or proving anything or even closing a door. It was about maintaining something I had already built, something that did not depend on his understanding or approval. I am not the one making a mistake, I said finally, and before he could respond, before the conversation could shift into something else, I ended the call, not abruptly, not emotionally, just decisively, and as I lowered the phone, I knew this was not the end of it, not for him, not for them, because once a pattern breaks, there is always an attempt to restore it, to pull things back into alignment with what used to be. But what they still did not understand was that there was nothing left to pull, nothing left to negotiate, because the version of me they were trying to reach no longer existed, and whatever came next would not follow the rules they had spent years enforcing. He did not call again that night, but the silence that followed was not empty, it carried intention, the kind that builds quietly before it surfaces in a different form, and 3 days later it did. I was in my office reviewing a set of revised projections when my assistant knocked lightly and stepped in, her expression neutral but slightly curious. There is someone here asking to see you, she said, and I glanced up, already knowing this was not a scheduled meeting. Did they give a name? I asked, and she nodded once, Richard Carter. And for a second, the room felt still in a way that was almost familiar, like a memory stepping into the present without warning. I closed the file in front of me slowly, not rushing, not reacting outwardly, and said, "Give me a moment," and as she stepped out, I sat back in my chair, letting the reality of it settle, because this was not a call I could end, not a message I could ignore. This was a choice to show up on his part in a space he had never occupied before. When I walked into the reception area, he was standing near the window, hands clasped loosely in front of him, looking out at the city below, and for the first time I saw him not as the fixed figure he had always been in my life, but as someone slightly out of place, like he had stepped into a setting he did not fully control. He turned when he heard my footsteps, his posture straightening almost automatically, and for a brief moment neither of us spoke, the distance between us measured not in steps but in years. "Emily," he said finally, his voice composed, but not as firm as I remembered, and I nodded once. "You should not have come here without an appointment," I said, not harsh, just factual, and he gave a small, almost dismissive shake of his head. "This could not wait," he replied, and there it was again, the assumption that his urgency should become mine. I gestured toward a conference room, a neutral space, glass walls, clean lines, nothing personal, and we stepped inside, the door closing softly behind us. He did not sit immediately, instead placing a folder on the table, sliding it slightly toward me. "I brought information," he said, and I remained standing for a second longer before taking a seat across from him, not opening the folder yet, just looking at him, waiting. "Daniel's situation is more complex than I explained," he continued, his tone measured, controlled. "There are liabilities, obligations that require immediate restructuring." And I listened, not interrupting, not engaging, letting him lay out the narrative he had prepared. "With your current involvement in large-scale financial operations, you are in a position to facilitate solutions," he added, and I noticed the phrasing, not asking for help, not acknowledging past behavior, just reframing the same expectation in more formal language. I finally reached for the folder, opening it slowly, scanning the documents inside, projections, debts, proposed partnerships, and it did not take long to see the pattern, the same overextension, the same assumptions, the same reliance on external support to stabilize something that had not been built with enough foundation. I closed the folder gently and slid it back toward him. "This is not a solution," I said, calm, direct, and he leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening. "It is a starting point," he replied. "And with your backing it becomes viable." And I met his gaze steadily. "No," I said, not louder, not sharper, just final. The word landed differently this time, not as a refusal at a dinner table, but as a decision in a room where he had come to negotiate, and I saw it register, not immediately, but in the subtle shift of his posture, the way his shoulders adjusted, the way his eyes narrowed slightly as he recalculated again. "You are choosing to separate yourself from this family," he said, and I shook my head once. That choice was made a long time ago, I replied, and for a moment there was nothing else, no argument, no raised voices, just two versions of reality that no longer aligned. He sat back then, exhaling slowly, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that was not control, not authority, but something closer to uncertainty, and I realized that this was not about convincing him. It never had been. It was about holding a line that he could not cross anymore. I stood up, signaling the end of the conversation without saying it directly, and he followed a second later, gathering the folder, his movements slower now, less certain. "This is not over," he said as he reached the door, and I nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement. "No," I said quietly, "it is not." And as he left, the door closing behind him, I understood that whatever came next would not be driven by requests or negotiations, but by consequences, the kind that unfold over time. And this time the position I held was not one that could be taken, only one that could be recognized, and they were only just beginning to understand what that meant. After he left my office, the building felt unusually quiet, not empty but settled, like something had just shifted into its final position, and I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the closed door, not because I was expecting him to come back, but because I understood that what had just happened was not just another conversation, it was a confirmation. Over the next few days, there were no calls, no messages, nothing from my father or my mother, and that absence was different from before. It did not feel like distance, it felt like recalibration, like they were trying to figure out their next move in a situation that was no longer predictable. At work, things continued to move forward, the division fully integrated now, the valuation stabilized, and my role becoming more defined with each passing week, and with that came visibility not just within the company but externally. Industry publications referencing the deal, profiles being written, interviews requested, and I declined most of them. Not out of fear, but because I had no interest in turning what I had built into something performative. Sophie, however, noticed the shift in her own way, not through headlines or reports, but through the subtle changes in our daily life, the increased flexibility, the opportunities that began to present themselves without being chased. And one evening, as we sat at the kitchen table, she looked at me and said, "Things are different now." Not as a question, but as an observation, and I nodded. Once, "Yes, they are," I said, and she leaned back slightly thoughtful. "Not just the money," she added, "the way people treat you." And I paused at that because she was right. There was a difference, not dramatic, not obvious, but present in the way conversations unfolded, in the way decisions were approached, in the way my input was received. "That is something you need to be careful with," I told her, not as a warning, but as a reminder. People do not always change, they just adjust to what they think you represent. And she nodded slowly, absorbing it, the same way she always did, quietly, thoughtfully. A week later, I received an email from my mother, not a message this time, not a short note, but something longer, structured, and when I opened it, I saw the difference immediately. The tone was softer, more reflective, and for the first time there was a hint of acknowledgement, not an apology, not directly, but something close. "I think we may have handled things poorly," she wrote, and I read that line twice, not because I did not understand it, but because I had never seen it before, not from her, not in any form. The rest of the email followed the same pattern, careful wording, references to family, to time, to the importance of connection, and at the end a suggestion, not a demand, not a request framed as an obligation but an invitation. "Perhaps we can have dinner, just us." And I sat there for a moment considering it, not emotionally, not reactively, just logically, because this was not about forgiveness, not yet, it was about understanding what had actually changed. I did not respond immediately, I let it sit, the same way I had learned to let everything sit, giving it space to reveal its true shape, and over the next 2 days I found myself thinking about it in small moments, not the dinner itself but what it represented, whether it was a genuine shift or simply another attempt to restore something that no longer existed. Sophie noticed it, of course she did, the way she always noticed things I did not say out loud, and one evening as we were finishing dinner, she asked, "Are you going to see them?" And I looked at her, really. Looked at her because her perspective mattered more than anything else in this equation, and I answered honestly, "I do not know yet." And she nodded, not pushing, not influencing, just accepting that the decision would come when it was ready. That night, after she went to her room, I sat at the kitchen table again, the same place where so many decisions had been made over the years, and I thought about that dinner, the one they were suggesting now, and the one that had changed everything, and I realized something that had not been clear before. This was not about going back. It could not be, because the structure that had existed before no longer held. This would be something else entirely, something that would either redefine the relationship or confirm that it was no longer there at all. And as I sat there in that quiet space, I understood that whatever choice I made next would not just affect me, it would set the tone for everything that followed. And this time I was not walking into it without knowing exactly where I stood. I did not respond to my mother's email that night or the next morning, and that was intentional, not out of hesitation but because I understood that timing mattered now in a way it never had before. And by the third day I replied with a single line, clear, measured, "We can meet for dinner next week." Nothing more, no added warmth, no conditions stated, just an agreement to step into whatever this was going to become. The restaurant she chose was not surprising, a quiet place downtown, the kind she had always preferred, dim lighting, polished tables, an atmosphere that suggested control and composure. And when I arrived, she was already there. Seated near the back, hands folded neatly in front of her, posture perfect as always, and for a brief second, it felt like stepping into a version of the past, but only for a second. She stood when she saw me, offering a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and I nodded once, taking the seat across from her, the distance between us measured in more than just the width of the table. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice softer than I remembered, and I responded simply, "You asked." And we both understood that was the truth of it. For the first few minutes the conversation stayed on the surface, the kind of neutral ground people use when they are not yet ready to address what actually matters: work, general updates, the safe topics that require no vulnerability. And I let it happen, not engaging deeply, not redirecting, just allowing her to reach whatever point she had come here for. Eventually she did, her hands shifting slightly on the table, her posture adjusting in a way that signaled a transition. "Emily," she said, and there was a pause, a small one but enough to mark the change. "I have been thinking about that night." And I held her gaze, waiting, not interrupting, not filling the space, and she continued, "We should not have approached you that way." And there it was, not an apology but closer than anything I had heard before. I nodded once, acknowledging it without amplifying it, and she exhaled softly, as if that small step had taken more effort than she expected. "Your father," she began, then stopped, recalibrating her words. "He is under a great deal of pressure." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was unexpected, but because it was familiar, the explanation, the context, the attempt to frame behavior as a response to circumstances rather than a choice. "That does not change what happened," I said, calmly, not dismissive, just clear, and she nodded again, slower this time. "I know," she replied, and for a moment there was silence, not uncomfortable but deliberate, like we were both recognizing that this conversation was not going to follow the patterns we were used to. The food arrived, plates placed between us, but neither of us reached for it immediately, the conversation still holding more weight than anything else in that room. "Things are different now," she said after a moment, and I looked at her, not questioning it, just waiting to see how she defined that difference. "You have built something significant," she added, and I could hear the careful wording, the acknowledgement wrapped in neutrality, and I responded simply, "Yes, I have," not out of pride but out of fact. She hesitated then, just slightly, before continuing, "Your father is concerned about the future, about stability." And I leaned back slightly, the pattern becoming clear again, the conversation shifting toward what they needed, what they were trying to secure, and I felt that same clarity settle in once more, the same one that had guided every decision since that night. "If this is about Daniel," I said, cutting through the structure she was building, "then we should be direct about that." And she paused, her expression tightening just enough to confirm it, and then she nodded. "He is struggling," she said, and there was a weight to it now, less polished, more real. "And your father believes that with your involvement things could be stabilized." And I let that sit for a moment, not reacting, not responding immediately, because this was the moment everything hinged on, not the request itself but how it was being framed, whether this was truly a different conversation or simply the same one with better language. I placed my hands lightly on the table, steady, grounded, and looked at her directly. "Nothing about this is going to be the same as before," I said, not as a warning, not as a negotiation, but as a statement of reality, and she held my gaze, searching for something in it, perhaps flexibility, perhaps a way back to what they understood. But what she found instead was something else entirely, something that did not bend the way it used to, and in that moment, I knew that whatever came next would not be about restoring the past, it would be about defining something entirely new, and whether they were ready for that or not was no longer something I needed to manage. She did not respond right away, not with words, but I saw it in the way her shoulders shifted slightly, the way her expression softened just enough to reveal something that had never been visible before, not in all the years I had known her as my mother, not in the way she had always carried herself, composed, certain, aligned with whatever direction my father set, but this was different, this was hesitation, and for a moment, I realized she was standing in the same position I had been in for most of my life, trying to navigate between expectation and reality without losing control of either. "What does that mean?" she asked finally, her voice quieter now, not defensive, not dismissive, just uncertain, and I let that question sit for a second before answering, not because I did not know what to say but because I wanted to be precise. "It means there are no assumptions anymore," I said, steady, clear. "No expectations based on family, no decisions made for me, and no access to what I have built without understanding exactly what it is and what it is not." And she nodded slowly, absorbing each part, not interrupting, not trying to redirect, and that alone told me this conversation was already different from anything we had had before. "Your father will not accept that easily," she said after a moment, and I almost smiled at the phrasing, not because it was wrong, but because it was predictable, and I responded simply, "He does not have to accept it." And this time there was no immediate response from her, just a quiet recognition settling in between us. The rest of the dinner unfolded without tension, but without pretense either. We spoke about practical things, about Sophie, about work, about what had changed and what had not, and for the first time there was no attempt to reshape my answers, no subtle correction, no redirection toward what they believed was appropriate, just listening, even if it was not complete understanding yet. When we stood to leave, she paused for a moment, looking at me in a way that felt unfamiliar, not as someone she needed to guide or correct, but as someone she was trying to understand. "You have done well," she said, and I held her gaze, not reacting immediately because those words carried weight, not because of the praise, but because of the acknowledgement behind them, and I nodded once. "I know," I said, not out of arrogance but out of certainty, and for a second something shifted in her expression, not disappointment, not disapproval, but something closer to acceptance. Outside, the air was cool, the city quieter than it had been when I arrived, and as I walked to my car, I realized that nothing about this had gone the way it would have in the past. There had been no pressure that I had absorbed, no expectation I had taken on, no compromise made to maintain something that no longer served me, and that realization settled in with a kind of calm that felt unfamiliar but right. Over the next few weeks there were no immediate follow-ups, no sudden requests, just space, real space, and that told me more than anything else because it meant they were processing, adjusting, trying to understand a structure that no longer operated the way it used to. Sophie continued forward in her own direction, building, exploring, shaping something that did not rely on a predefined path, and one afternoon as we sat together reviewing one of her ideas, she looked up at me and said, "I think I finally understand what you meant," and I raised an eyebrow slightly. "About what?" I asked, and she smiled just a little. "About not letting anyone decide what something is worth before it has a chance to become something more." And I leaned back in my chair, watching her for a moment, seeing not just the person she was, but the path she was already creating, and I realized then that everything that had happened, every decision, every moment of pressure, every refusal had led to this, not just a change in position, but a change in perspective that would carry forward far beyond anything my parents had ever tried to control. I did not know exactly what the future would look like, not in specific terms, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity: the foundation had shifted permanently, and whatever came next would be built on something entirely different, something that could not be taken, only grown, and for the first time that was more than enough.